A competitive equilibrium arises from the interactions of many consumers and many producers, each trying to do the best they can given their circumstances. We'll illustrate this here by building up from individual consumers and producers to the market supply and demand picture that gives us the equilibrium that arises when everyone does the best he or she can. We'll begin with a consumer we'll call consumer I, and we'll suppose that this consumer faces a price of P1 for the good X1, and we'll assume that X2 is a composite good. So the slope of the green budget constraint that the consumer faces is then simply determined by the price of good 1. If this consumer faces this price, she'll simply choose the best possible bundle she can given her tastes, and thus arrive at her optimal consumption level of X1. If the price falls to P1 star, then the budget constraint becomes shallower and the optimal decision for this consumer changes. In our case, the consumer will consume more of the good X1. And if the price falls yet again to P1 prime, the consumer's optimal decision will change again increasing her consumption of X1. As we first saw in Chapter 9, each one of these optimal bundles translates to 1 point on the consumer's demand curve for the good X1. For instance, if the price is P1, then at the price of P1, we know the consumer consumes the green quantity, which gives us 1 point on the consumer's demand curve in panel D. At the lower price of P star, the consumer consumes the blue quantity, giving us a 2nd point on the consumer's demand curve. And at the even lower price of P1 prime, we derive the magenta quantity as the quantity that the consumer will demand along her demand curve. Connecting these, we then get an estimate of consumer I's individual demand curve for the good X1. Of course, there are many such consumers, and to get to the market demand curve, we'll have to add up all these individual demand curves as we illustrated in graph 14.1. Horizontally adding all these individual demand curves then gives us the market demand curve in the output market as simply the sum of the individual demand curves. Notice that this market demand curve arises from individual optimizing behavior. Each consumer, taking prices as given, does the best she can given her circumstances, and this then translates into individual demand curves that get summed to market demand curves. On the producer side, we'll begin again with a single producer, producer J, and the producer choice set that this producer faces. We'll assume here that we're dealing with a short-run producer choice set where only labor is the input that can be varied. As we first saw in Chapter 11, we can derive from the shape of the production frontier the shape of the cost curve. In our case, the producer is facing initially increasing returns to scale but eventually decreasing returns to scale, which implies that initially costs will increase at a decreasing rate, but eventually they'll increase at an increasing rate. From the cost curve, we can derive the marginal cost curve and the average cost curve, and we know that the producer's supply curve will be the portion of the marginal cost curve that lies above the average cost. We can therefore derive from the initial producer choice set in panel B the producer's supply curve in panel F. With many producers in the competitive market, we therefore get many such supply curves, and we have to add these up to get the market supply curve as we first illustrated in graph 14.1. The market supply and market demand curves will then intersect at the equilibrium price, which in our case is P1 star. That price then sends a signal to consumers which tells them how much to consume, and it sends a signal to each producer that tells each producer how much to produce. In this equilibrium, the quantity supplied will then be equal to the quantity demanded, as everyone does the best they can given the circumstances they face, where part of those circumstances involves the equilibrium price P star that arose from all the individual interactions in the marketplace. I'm sure you've seen a graph like panel E before, where demand curve intersects a supply curve to form an equilibrium price in a competitive market. What we've done now is we've built the background to how these demand and supply curves arise. They arise from individual consumers and individual producers doing the best they can given the prices that they face, where those prices arise in the marketplace from the interactions of many consumers and many producers. Prices signal consumers and producers in ways that coordinate their behavior and allow them to cooperate without realizing that that's what they're doing. All they're doing is the best they can given their circumstances.